think I messed up. This is my first facilitation, moderation, but maybe they'll invite me back, maybe not. Okay. This might be one of the busiest people that I know. So Jeremy has been building movements since he was 8 years old. He is the co-founder and CEO of Purpose, a public benefit corporation with offices on 6 continents. Purpose builds and supports movements for an open, just, and habitable world. He's co-founder of Get Up. This is an Australian political organization with more members than all of Australia's political parties combined. He's also co-founder of Avaz, the world's largest online citizens movement, now with more than 65 million members. And last but not least, he is the co-author of a book that is titled New Power: How Power Works in Our Hyper-Connected World and How to Make It Work for You. So welcome, my friend, and you're not busy at all these days, are you?
Well, it's great to be here and great to be in Paris with all of you, and looking forward to this conversation. Yeah, no, it's such a privilege for me to be associated with all of these remarkable people, and I've obviously read so much about you, so I've been looking forward to this for a long time. But I would like for you to tell us about your activism and how you came to understand New Power. Yeah, well, as Jonathan said, I got started very young. So, and unlike Louisa and Clover, who I would say were more sophisticated activists as young people than I was, back in my day, you know, when I started this kind of work, I was organizing fax campaigns. So trying to get people to send faxes en masse, which is an extremely limiting activist tool. And it led to many failures, really. When I tried to get people to mass fax the hotel where, at age 12, I think it was, where the Iraqi foreign minister and the US Secretary of State were meeting on the eve of the Gulf War, we got maybe, I don't know, 40, 50 faxes through that one machine, right? So the techniques have changed, but for me, that's been a through line in my life. And fast forward a little bit to 2004, and suddenly we had the internet, and I was a student at that time, and we all thought that the worst possible president that could ever be was George W. Bush, and it turned out that there's been one worse since then. And so it was 2004, we were trying to get George Bush out of office. And so that was when we started experimenting. And that time is a really exciting time when we were figuring out how to use the internet in new ways to mobilize people. And so we did things like organize one of the very first ever political crowdfunding campaigns to fly a group of women whose loved ones had died in Iraq around to chase Dick Cheney wherever he was. It was called the Chasing Cheney campaign. And so, you know, that's kind of my story, and that then led to a whole bunch of other things in the years that have followed. Fantastic. I would like to ask you to open up to us a little bit, and you know, your influence and your successes are very well known, and huge gratitude for everything you've done since, you know, you were 8 years old. What failures have you encountered personally or professionally, and what have they taught you about activism? Yeah, I mean, I actually think that some of my biggest failures in my work as an activist were actually some of the moments that appeared to be the most successful, right? So there are these campaigns you can run that you get millions of people to sign the petition or to get involved, that speak to people's, you know, hearts, or that get people angry. But a number of those campaigns, and this is also how my work as an activist has evolved a lot over the years, were really just exercises in virtue signaling to ourselves, right? Now, it's absolutely important that people who share the same values get riled up, get motivated, take action. That's a critical theory of change. But I do think that as activists, we need to be honest with ourselves about some of the incentives, right, that we have as activists. And so to make this concrete, thinking about refugees as an issue. So I've been working over many years on different kinds of campaigns around refugees. And, you know, I think the correct thing to do, right, if you're a progressive activist, is to try to humanize refugees. So center the voices of refugees, have refugees speak about their own experiences in an attempt to persuade people that they should support the rights of refugees. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That's very important, and it has its own merits. But what I learned on refugees, for example, was that doing that over and over again didn't change the minds of the people that we actually need to shift policies on refugees. So the way we sort of made progress on that issue was when we realized that the people in this room don't need convincing anyway, right? And those were the people who wanted to hear from the refugees. But when you actually spoke to the people who were conservative or skeptical about refugees, but who had welcomed refugees into their own communities. So there are these programs all over the world. They're called refugee sponsorship programs, right? Where people agree to sponsor a refugee. Often it's quite religious, quite conservative people, and then they bring a refugee or a family into their community. When you record those people talking about how their prejudices shifted, how their lives changed as a result of getting to know and building deep relationships with refugees, that message is much more effective, right, at actually persuading skeptical people to support policies that help refugees. And that's not necessarily the message that's most comfortable or most easy. And so I think in my career, particularly in my early career, we ran a lot of campaigns that got millions of people involved. Some of them were really effective, and others, I think, less so. Partly because your incentive as an activist, and this is where the dangers are, can sometimes be either rack up the numbers or do something that feels very comfortable within the epistemic frame, the community that we're comfortable within. And I think that's a big structural mistake, if we actually want to unlock the change that we need to on so many of these issues.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. I realize before my next question, I need to ask you to describe old power and new power. If you could do that for us, and then I want to talk about new power.
Yeah, so this concept of new power is something that that Henry Timms and I sort of developed partly just in response to what the debates we were seeing in the world, particularly in that early social media era. So if you remember the Arab Spring, right, and everyone would have this constant debate about the Arab Spring. Did Twitter cause the Arab Spring, right? And then when the Arab Spring kind of went wrong, people were like, well, Twitter doesn't work. And to us, that was a really limiting way to understand social change. Because as an activist, the one thing you know is that if you really want to understand what's happening, you have to understand power. Who has it, who doesn't, how it works. So the concept of old and new power was a frame we developed that was to help give people a better language to use when talking about change. So in very simple terms, the difference between old and new power, we all know what old power is, right? It's what most of the machinery of our societies works on, right? The analogy we use is it's power as currency, right? The more of it you have, the more powerful you are. You hoard it up, and then you have more power, right? New power, though, we were trying to describe the sort of power that Fridays for the Future, that folks like Clover are exercising, right, today. It's not the same kind of power. It isn't the same kind of power. You can't hoard it up. It's not something you spend to reward your friends and punish your enemies. It's a different power because it's about harnessing participatory energy. It's about channeling the power of many people's collective action. And it's enabled by technology, no doubt, but it's actually a very distinct mindset and a very distinct set of skills. And that's kind of what we described in our work in Harvard Business Review and then in our book on new power. And to be very clear, it can be used by the good guys and the bad guys. And a big theme of our work has increasingly become the way the bad guys have co-opted new power and what we do about it.
Can we stay there for a second? Can you just, what do we do about it?
Well, I mean, I think part of the issue is that we can't unilaterally disarm. So, and this is often, an issue. Like, people rightly are outraged by the way social media companies, for example, have monetized and monopolized and co-opted all of this participatory energy to not only to make money for themselves, but also to polarize and to damage democracies. But those who are spreading hate and disinformation are using these tools, right? We wrote an article before COVID, weirdly the year before COVID, saying analyzing the phenomenon of vaccine skeptics and vaccine disinformers, basically, saying these guys threaten to really undermine global public health. We didn't know what was about to come. And the vaccine skeptics are brilliant at using new power. They don't have a lot of institutional power. They don't have the bully pulpit of government, typically, although they do in some states in the United States now. But they do have these very powerful communities that they can use from actually a very small number of people are the originators of the information, and then that information metastasizes and spreads through these communities. So the biggest implication, I think, is that those of us in this room who kind of share a set of values need to use new power, but we also need to change the structure in which we're all operating, right? And there's probably been not enough attention by activists on changing the technology architecture, on pushing back around the power of big tech, and we're seeing that again now with AI.
I want to come back to AI, which is something I know virtually nothing about, but I know you do. But I've been told that there aren't any stupid questions, so here goes. And you've touched on this already, but what happens to modern-day movements and new power when the electricity literally goes out? And I'm only asking this half joking. I've spent the bulk of my life with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, in parts of the world responding to conflict, et cetera, where literally power doesn't exist. And so really the question that I want to ask you is, can new power be truly accessible and inclusive?
Well, I mean, it's absolutely true that this ain't evenly distributed, right? And that's a big problem. And it's part of why, again, activists, there are a certain set of issues that are relatively unsexy, but they're structural, right? One is the corrupting influence of money and politics and the way that impacts democracy, and a set of issues around democracy. Really hard to build movements around process, right? And another is the architecture, particularly this online environment that we're in and how it's built. That stuff is a bit arcane. How do we reform that? How do we increase access to technology? But it tends to be the kind of, it defines the playing field that we then all play on as activists. So what I would say is, on the plus side, I've seen some brilliant examples of activism that don't rely on technology, right? Or that use extremely low-tech tools. And people are incredibly ingenious about using whatever technology they have at the time. And I've described in the past the phenomenon of missed calls campaigns as a good example of this. So in places like India and sub-Saharan Africa, where people can't afford to use data on their cell phones, activism evolved to create these campaigns where people would call a number and hang up before it incurred any phone charges as a way of registering an action and then coordinating offline protests. So people will find a way, but that doesn't change the structural problem that you identified, Jonathan, which is that we as activists need to spend more time figuring out how to level that playing field.
Thank you. Yeah. For those of us that are waking up every morning, going to work, to deal with a sick planet, to try to reverse the climate crisis, to try to reverse nature's collapse, through your lens of new power or just your massive experience with activism, what is your advice? What is your guidance? What do you see that's working? What do you see that maybe we could be doing a little bit differently?
Well, first, I mean, incredibly inspiring hearing from the climate activists that we've heard from today. And what they're doing is super smart and strategic, right? What Louisa described, for example, in Germany. I think, let me tell you a story about some climate activism that Purpose has done that I think is instructive. And it speaks to this point I made about reaching the audiences that are usually neglected by activism. So a few years back, Poland was hosting the COP, right? And so our climate lab at Purpose had to figure out, is there something useful we can do, given that the Polish government, as you know, is right-wing, it's quite hostile to climate action, And it's also, frankly, there's a very strong relationship between the right-wing politics of Poland, the coal industry, and the Catholic Church. So we looked at that and we said, well, what's the best lever to break that? And we identified conservative Catholics, right, who were key to the base of the Law and Justice Party in Poland. So basically, we worked with activists in Poland and organizers in Poland to basically help to sprout a Catholic Polish climate movement. And one of the most interesting things we discovered when we started this work was that most Catholic Poles are not big fans of the current Pope, right? They think he's too left-wing. They probably think he's a bit woke. But they do love, unsurprisingly, the Polish Pope, John Paul II. So we went back to people who'd worked with and knew John Paul II, who could be voices from there. We went back to John Paul II's scriptures, right, because he actually spoke a bunch about nature and environmental stewardship, and developed a campaign that was so different to the kinds of language and climate campaigns that we normally see, right? And it was prayer cards in churches, and it was organizing so that Catholic priests would give sermons, right, in churches in Poland the week of the COP. And we had thousands and thousands of these sermons. And I think the mark of the success of the campaign was that, while the Polish government is still no great friend of climate action, we were able to get to the point where the Polish environment minister stood up in the COP and said, and again, this may make some people feel uncomfortable, right? And said, we cannot cede the issue of climate change to the left. Climate change is also a conservative issue, right? But I think that's the kind of thing we need, right? Because we're not going to win simply by rallying progressives alone. So that's an example of a strategy that was quite different. There are lots of things that I would so strongly disagree with the Catholic Church on, right? But the ability to work with them on that, and we worked with the Vatican, right, because the current Pope, of course, is a very strong proponent of climate action on that campaign, I think is an example of some stuff that I'm seeing that is working.
If you could come to my country and help us cross the tribal lines, that would be incredible. That's the U.S.
I live there too, so
okay.
I live it.
So back to AI. I know next to nothing about AI.
Yeah.
But the friends of mine who are much smarter than I am say it's something I should be scared to death about. And so I just want you to put it in the context of activism, civic action, movement building, new power.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this, and there's no doubt that it's a really big deal. I don't think we fully know how it's going to play out. But here's a way to think about it. Like, our work on New Power described this explosion of participation by ordinary people. The fact that now everybody in this room could start a movement, could start a campaign. The Greta example is such an inspiring one, right? That one girl who helped to spark not one girl's campaign, but actually this huge ecosystem of self-organized campaigns. But the new world we're about to enter is in which there is a new participatory agent that is arriving, and that is the machine. So alongside humans, suddenly we have these machines, and I use machines as essentially a shorthand for these AI models that are configured to interact directly with humans, to be human-like, and in some cases to be directly mistaken for humans. So there'll be lots of situations where we don't know whether we're really speaking to a human or a machine. And these participatory agents are going to have a huge impact on the way both old power and new power play out. So I think one very concerning feature of this is that we could see a massive reconcentration of information. So these chatbots that we're going to talk to are going to become our best friends. You could almost think of them as your digital significant other. We're going to interact with them. They're going to give us these very personalized, very useful answers. And I think increasingly we're going to rely on these digital significant others for answers, for information that we used to get from social media and that we used to get from search. And so all of that information gets laddered up to this one voice who will synthesize these very persuasive answers just for you. And I think that's quite scary, because that means that there'll be enormous power in the hands of the owners of those machines in determining what those voices say, and perhaps even more concerning, the owners of those machines themselves don't fully understand how they work. and they find that in a sense, their workings are indecipherable because of the nature of the technology, these LLMs, right? And so therefore, not even the owners of the machines really control them. So from an activist perspective, we've been trying to think about what it all means. And I do think we're going to see that these new tools give both good actors and bad actors a really major set of new tools. So you'll see this kind of information bombing dynamic, where you used to be able to, if you were ISIS, for example, you could spread propaganda person to person online, and that was very effective at recruiting. But imagine if you could create 10,000 times the amount of content that the ISIS folks created, but that content would also be more personalized. So they would know, okay, we're not just trying to recruit young girls from the West over to Syria. We're trying to find the exact preferences and interests of those teenagers, and we're going to produce 1,000 different versions of a piece of content in the voice of what appears to be a human designed to recruit those people. That's a very, very scary prospect, but it, again, also means that activists who are fighting things like for climate action will need to figure out how to use these tools as well, but in a way that is ethical and in a way that doesn't create some of these runaway train dynamics. So I think it's going to be really important for, again, all of us to be highly engaged with these debates, and as activists, think about how these tools get used very quickly.
We're a minute over, but I want to give you 20 seconds to tell us, what are you doing now? When you leave here, what is in your heart? What's going on? In 20 seconds.
Well, I mean, right now, I'm queer, and I am working, one of the issues I'm working on is I feel like queer people and trans people, yet again, are being turned into the boogeymen all over the world. In America, where I live, by populists, by authoritarians. So one of the things I'm working on right now is there something we can do to stem the tide of this backlash against queer people? Because I think that it's a canary in the coal mine for many, many other minority groups, because essentially the fight is this idea that queer people represent modernity, decadence, the modern world. And they won't just come for queer people, but as you've seen in the US, they're coming for women and their reproductive rights. They're coming for people of color. And so, given that's one of my identities, I'm working on some new ways to organize queer people around the world transnationally to address that problem.
Dude.
Thanks.
You're a star. I appreciate you.
Pleasure. Thank you.